LGIU. I'm very grateful to you all for joining us for this post-COP seminar. We're going to be looking at, we've got some great speakers, I'll introduce them in a minute. We're going to be looking at some of the key issues that arise from COP for local government. What are some of the biggest challenges facing local government as we seek to mitigate and adapt to climate change? What do we need to be doing more of? What could we be doing less of, etc.? We saw a big focus at COP on, I think, a big focus on what national governments need to do separately and together. And we also know there's a huge amount that we as individuals, as families, as communities can do, how we eat, how we live, how we travel. But I felt perhaps that space in the middle, local government as a sort of connective tissue that sort of runs between the individual and the national level, was perhaps a bit squeezed out. So it'll be interesting to hear from our panelists about what they think that should involve. So we are at LGIU, we're the Local Government Information Unit. Many of you will know us. Many of you are members of LGIU. I'm especially delighted to welcome all of you here this morning. We've been doing a huge amount of work on climate change recently in relation to COP, but we've also had a long-running engagement going back 15 years on how local government can engage more effectively with climate issues. We've had our Centre for Local Sustainability, we've had our local energy subsidiary. We've done work with both the European Union and with individual councils around the country looking at their sustainability practices and low energy as and how we transition to a more low energy economy. And I'll say a little bit more about LGIU's work in a minute. This event is run out of our Local Democracy Research Centre, which is a new initiative from LGIU designed to bring local government practitioners and academics together to co-create new ideas and new knowledge. So we are delighted to be running this event with the Heseltine Institute for Public Policy Practice and Place at the University of Liverpool. They're exactly the sort of partner we wanted to work with on these issues. They're doing some amazing work around the importance of place in shaping and delivering public policy. So we're delighted to be working with them. We have some fantastic speakers for you this morning, so I'm going to move straight on to them, but just a little bit about how this works. We're running that. We've got so many people who are interested. We had over 170 people registered for the call. So we are running this as a webinar, which means that the conversation with you, the audience, will be via the chat function. So we're going to hear from each of our speakers first, and we're going to have a brief conversation amongst them, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. This event is being recorded, so bear that in mind when you make your contributions. And I will introduce our speakers in turn. First up, we have, and I should say that we're missing a speaker. Stephen Finnegan, who's the director of the Zero Carbon Research Institute at the University of Liverpool, is unwell this morning, so is unable to join us. But that will give a little bit more space in a packed agenda to our other panelists. So we hope he gets well soon, and we'll miss his contribution, but it's still going to be a great discussion. First up is Chris Murray, who's director of Core Cities UK. He's worked in, he'll be well known to many of you as a leading sort of thinker about sort of urban issues. He's worked in a number of cities across the UK. He's a visiting professor of practice at Newcastle University. He's an honorary fellow of the Heseltine Institute, and he's on the advisory board of the Prime Minister's Regeneration Investment Organisation. So he's right at the heart of working with cities. Here at LGIU, we've been very pleased over the years to collaborate with Core Cities on a number of projects, particularly around local government finance. But this now is the big public policy question of our time. So Chris, where do Core Cities sit in all of this, and what do we need to do?
Hi, Jonathan. I just check that you can hear me okay.
We can hear you. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So I think I did attend COP. I was there, during the first week and the second week, and I think overall my analysis of it. I mean, you were going to talk about the kind of national level outcomes. And I think in some ways, we all recognise there's a long way to go on that. In terms of its sort of profile, more generally amongst the public, I think it's definitely the highest profile COP that certainly that I've seen. But there was a sense in which I think a lot of people I heard speak, it was as if they were making their kind of maiden presentation on climate change, and a lot of it felt really behind the curve. The exception to that, I would say, was a lot of the local leaders that were there, and that was, my sense was, that was where a lot of the innovation in the dialogue was coming out. A key moment for me personally was when we ran our event on financing net zero at the level of the city, at the level of local government. And we've been working on this for about a year with London councils, all the core cities, the Connected Places Catapult Centre, to try and create a model for net zero investment to deliver net zero. And the moment really was when we had about 150 really senior finance figures there in city chambers, listening to what we had to say, responding incredibly positively to that. And I just thought, actually, this is fantastic. We're making progress here. And one of the reasons that we focused on that issue specifically is that it's where we feel as a group of cities the biggest gap is currently. So broadly, in terms of net zero, we know what we need to do. There are some gaps there, but we know broadly what we need to do. Broadly, public opinion is shifting in line with those actions, with what we need to do. But we don't know how to pay for it. We haven't got the cash there to pay for it. So the first thing we did was to set out and calculate the cost of that across the 11 core cities in London. So those 12 cities, that's quite a lot of the UK actually in one basket. When you look at it, it's about 60% of the economy and more than half the population. And the cost of that comes in at about 200 billion. So that is clearly way beyond the ability of the public sector to deliver. The money is just not there. It's never going to be there. You need private investment for that. And that money, the private money is there. Investors tell us that. They've allocated huge sums to investment in net zero, but that's not landing. And what investors are saying to us is that the proposals that are coming forward either are not fully worked up, they don't provide a return, and are simply not investable propositions for them. So the next phase of our work, which again we launched at COP, was to try and develop a model to deal with that, to deliver that. And we've come up with a place-based blended finance model. It moves between public and private money, uses them for different things, uses the public money to de-risk schemes, to bring the private money in, and it invests. I'll put something in the chat on this, a link in the chat to it, to the work, and it invests across several asset classes at the same time, across energy, transport, commercial property, domestic property, and waste. And there are areas within that are relatively easy to get a financial return from. For example, renewable energy, that gives a very good return, whereas things like waste and private housing retrofit are much more difficult to do. It's much more difficult to get any return from them. So what this model does is operate at the level of the neighbourhood and read across between those elements of investment that are easier to get a return from and those that are almost impossible, and uses revenues from one to pump prime the other, but leaves enough return, enough juice in the scheme, as it were, to make it attractive to investors to create a return. And although it's at a neighbourhood level, it's capable of being scaled up across a whole city, or indeed groups of cities. So you're then getting into the billions in terms of investment proposition, and that is where you start to get interest from patient global capital that is willing to invest for the long term and look at what in the short term will be regarded as very low returns. That's still attractive to them, big pension companies, sovereign wealth funds, and so on. And the good news about this is that the private sector really liked it. We had, for example, Chief Executive HSBC, the Chair of the UK Infrastructure Bank, the Secretary General of the OECD speaking at our events. And we've pitched this to government too. And we're at the stage now where we need to get to proof of concept on this. And others are doing similar work, actually. There are similar pieces of work out there, but we need someone to get over the line to make this a practical reality so that we can get on and start delivering that pathway to net zero. The C40 said to us that they haven't seen in-country city networks operating quite in that way, and I thought that was very interesting. And I do, this is not a cynical point, but I do wonder sometimes whether actually we are innovating in that way, because we don't have those solutions at the moment from national government. So we are seeing innovation coming out of local government in that way. And my final point on this is that I think what was less positive is that national conversations just seem to forget about localities. That actually of course it's important to agree this stuff at the national level, absolutely critical, and we didn't quite get there, but it's delivered locally, it's delivered in places. The heavy lifting for a lot of this is actually in the hands of local, not national government, and local government's got to be a bigger part of those conversations globally. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. And yes, I mean, we would certainly agree with that last point. That was my sense also, that there was just not enough focus on the sort of role of local government in connecting and delivering all of this, and place as a kind of organizing concept kind of went missing a little bit. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you, but what we're going to do is we're going to hear from all our panelists, and then we'll open it up. Indeed, there are already some questions for you coming through on the chat, but we're going to move on to our next panelist, who is Marie Delaney, who's the Chief Executive of Offaly County Council in Ireland, has been since February 2016. Time does not permit me to list all the many and varied roles that Marie has had over a long career in local government, but suffice to say, she's done an awful lot, and has sort of, I think, almost every aspect of local government, and certainly a large number of places she's had a role in shaping. So really good to have you with us today, Marie, and really interested to hear your perspective on sort of where next for local government post-COP.
Good morning, Jonathan, and thanks to everybody, or thanks for the invitation this morning to speak at the webinar, and I'm delighted to be here to profile the local government role. I suppose really the standout for me from COP26, I suppose, was the effort to advance the coal phase out, and that concerted deliberation towards consigning coal to history. And I know it became contentious in the watering down of language from coal phase out to coal scale down. But within this, there were significant new commitments which represent progress towards phase out. And a key standout also, I suppose, and a positive outcome of COP26 and a model for other similar agreements is the $8.5 billion partnership between the US, the UK, France, Germany, and the EU to fund South Africa's transition from coal to a clean energy economy over the next 5 years. And it was interesting to hear US President Joe Biden explaining that it would see South Africa close its coal plants more quickly than scheduled, while supporting an equitable, inclusive transition to renewables. And indeed, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also talked about the deal being a template on how to support the just transition process. I suppose that resonated with me. I suppose we have a huge appreciation. I have a huge appreciation here for what lies ahead for those regions and communities that are associated with those coal plants, really because of our own experiences here and my own personal experience as a chief executive in a rural local authority, Offaly County Council here in Ireland. As in the last number of years, we have been dealing with the Midlands just transition process. For the best part of a century, peat extraction for energy generation in Ireland has been concentrated in the Midlands region, with Bord na Móna, the state agency responsible for peat extraction, supplying the ESB, the Electricity Supply Board, for electricity generation at 3 large power plants. And throughout the years, the peat and power generation industries had come to be the economic and the social backbone of communities across the Midlands region. So communities and villages have been built around those particular industries. In 2018, the cessation of the peat extraction activities across 21 bogland areas and the closure of 2 power plants, one of which was in my own county of Offaly, that happened much more quickly than scheduled also. And that resulted in significant job losses, a deep blow to the communities that relied on those industries. And I suppose since 2018, we have led the just transition process in the Midlands region. We've established and we oversee the Midlands Regional Transition Team, and that's a collective of regional and local stakeholders to concentrate on measures to support impacted employees and impacted communities. It's a unique collective, and we have worked to support employees and communities on a wide range of initiatives, including identifying opportunities through training and upskilling, sourcing funding for projects, capacity building, exploring the economic opportunities that can be capitalised in the journey of transition away from a reliance on the heavy fossil-based industry to a future of clean energy, new technology, new skills, employment opportunities. So the South Africa Just Transition piece, that was a key standout for me because of my own understanding of the challenges and opportunities that will lie ahead for those communities and for the local governments and state agencies that will no doubt work to support their communities in whatever way they can. Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And I think that's a really important reminder that, Chris talked about how you finance this, and we'll talk also no doubt about some of the economic opportunities involved in the transition to a low carbon economy. But it's a really important reminder that for some communities, that transition is not a straightforward one. It comes with loss. It comes with significant readjustment. And if we're not focused, as you were talking about, on how we support that, we're not going to be able. Well, not only will we not be able to transition in a just and equitable way, but we may not be able to do so at all because it will create areas of resistance and difficulty. So I think that's a really important point, and interesting to that's not just from coal but from peat, which hasn't formed much of the public conversation, certainly. Okay, our next speaker is Mark Atherton, who is the Director of Environment at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. He's got a long track record in Greater Manchester. He joined AGMA, the Association of Greater Manchester Authorities, which is sort of and sort of not the predecessor of the GMCA, back in 2012. In his current role, he provides strategic support to the Greater Manchester Low Carbon Hub. He's also been part of the North East Regional Development Agency and worked as Director of Energy and Environment there. He's done a whole lot of work around sort of investment, infrastructure, and shift to different energy use. Mark, over to you. What's your perspective on COP and issues arising from it for local government? Mark, can you hear us? There you go. Yep, we can hear you now.
I think somebody needs to, there we go, start the video. That's it. Morning, everybody. So thank you for having me along today. I think COP has been a bit of a whirlwind, and those of us who have been heavily involved are probably sinking back and reflecting on what actually was achieved. And although at the high level, I think most commentators would say that COP26 perhaps didn't live up to expectation, there was quite a lot within the announcements that have sort of been buried a little bit, and it's worth just highlighting a couple of them. The ones I'm going to focus on are around innovation, because whilst there was some contention around coal, around deforestation, and around some of the really big issues that globally international leaders find very difficult to find common ground on, where they find easier commonality is around the innovation agenda. And there was an announcement on day 2 of COP as part of the Breakthrough Agenda initiative, which was aimed at scaling up technologies with applications in sectors that account for more than half of global emissions, with the aim of increasing their affordability and scale by 2030. And these are technologies such as low carbon hydrogen, sustainable agricultural systems, low carbon transport, and so forth. And all of the big hitters signed up to that. So US, India, China, UK, EU, and more. And then a couple of days later, the UK government, in association with the International Energy Agency, launched a COP26 product efficiency call, a call to action. And that was really about doubling the energy efficiency of things like air conditioning systems, refrigeration, industrial systems, motor systems, lighting by 2030. Now, these are quite substantial announcements, really, because one of the challenges, and Chris mentioned this in his piece, it's about affordability. We all know that, certainly in the UK, what we need to do as a society is decarbonize our heat and decarbonize our transport. And there's lots of other things that we have to do, but they're the two big things. And in both of those areas, one of the key barriers is around cost. So having some of the world's largest economies focusing their attention on innovation that will drive energy efficiency in those technologies which are inherent to the energy system, or focusing on technologies which can particularly halve global emissions in their use, whether that be concrete or soil even. That's really quite an interesting announcement. And the reason it finds favor with most countries is that they can see the economic potential in it. They can see the green jobs. They can see the opportunity for attracting global markets. And I do think that those two things could potentially help us to get from where we are. And just to remind people, we went into COP with the idea of trying to maintain 1.5 degrees C, and we came out of COP with a bit of a wing and a prayer saying, well, we might do 1.8 to 2.4, but some of those technologies are going to get us that 1.8 to 2.4. So in terms of announcements, I think those were the two key ones that that struck me as being particularly important. On day 10 of COP, I was really pleased to see that over 1,000 cities and local government are now participating in Race to Zero, because I think local authorities and local government do have a huge role to play in this. But to have credibility, we need to lead by example. And if we haven't got local authorities in particular having a net zero plan and being able to show progress against that on their own estates, as well as the levers that they have through the planning system, for example, then we have very little chance of convincing other people to do the same, whether that be business or society more generally. The final thing I'll mention as my highlight, if you like, of COP, the Northwest region was particularly well represented at COP. We took up a partnership of public sector, private sector, and NGO. We ran a number of events. The highlight for me was on the final day, where we partnered with Glasgow as the host city to run an international mayor's event. And both Steve Rotherham at Liverpool and Mandy Burnham from Manchester were on stage, but also so was Tracy Bravian from West Yorkshire. And we had about 7 other international mayors. And the whole focus of that session was on transferable projects. So projects that were already happening within those cities and city regions that were already having an impact on decarbonising the economy of those city regions that were easily transferable. And for me, and maybe this is where we'll go into the next part of the session, it's a really key role for local authorities. We need to be able to ditch the whole idea of not made here and look across the globe to see what is actually working and transfer it. Because and this is my final point, that the challenge we have is now we are in a race against time. So we have a very small number of years to make a substantial difference before, to be honest with you, our carbon budgets are blown. So transferring things that work and making them embedded and widely adopted as we can, and joining together to make those things happen as local authorities to create aggregation demand, and which will drive down price, for me, has to be the key thing that we all focus on as local authorities in the next 24 months. Thank you.
Fantastic, Mark. Thank you. Always nice when people do my job for me, because that does indeed move us very neatly to the next session, which just to kind of come back to all the panelists a bit more on what exactly local government to be doing. And I think that point about transferability is really important, isn't it? Because in a sense, the sort of pushback on local action is always, well, that it's local, that it's bounded, that it's not, that it's not big enough. And actually, clearly what we need, is innovation that spreads and is shared and transferred between local authorities, between different areas, both nationally and internationally. So I'd just like to pick up on that a little bit. Maybe coming back to you first, Anna Marie. How far, what do you think we need in order to enable that sort of, obviously we've had the COP as a focus point, that people have sort of shared information and we're having conversations like this, and great. What do we need sustainably to sort of enable us to do that kind of knowledge transfer and that sort of collaboration and that sort of aggregation that Mark was talking about?
Yeah, I think, and she's right, both Mark and Chris have mentioned there, or Chris in particular, around the financing piece, that's critical. And I think as well as that, the leadership role of local authorities, and I believe we have a strong leadership role to play in delivering climate action and are well placed to do it. And I think it's in relation to the community piece really, and the community engagement, and we're very well placed to do that. Okay,
and how do those things, I mean, Chris, you talked a lot about new financial models, about getting proof of concept, about working with big institutional financial players. We know that we also need that community leadership role. How do those two things interrelate? Is there a danger that they sort of sit in separate sort of boxes of activity, and how do we bring them together effectively? You're unmuted, I think.
Yeah, so I can't unmute myself.
Don't worry, I'll do it.
Yeah, great. Well, I think collaboration is got to be the kind of the new competition, really, and we've got to set aside any sense of kind of first over the line, or as Mark said, not made here. And I think there are specific ways in which we can collaborate better that I'll come on to perhaps as the discussion develops in the next few minutes. But I think what I would like to do is just set out some of the challenges that we face as local government in getting to that. So in order to collaborate, in order to innovate, I think there are three really big challenges, really significant challenges we've got to overcome. And the first is this, and this might sound odd to people outside of local government, but actually, in order for us to solve the climate crisis and to work on that, we've got to solve the social care crisis, because actually a lot of capacity and funding within local government is completely absorbed by this. And although we've had an announcement on national insurance, actually very little of that money is going to go towards social care. So if we want local government to really fulfil its full role and potential in this respect, we've got to sort out issues of capacity within the sector. I think the second challenge is the centralisation that we have in the UK and in England in particular, although actually the devolved cities in the devolved nations would I'm sure say the same. And what was interesting at COP is that we were alongside and exposed to the environments that cities globally work in. And it's just really hard to find any developed nation that has the kind of centralisation that we've got here. Local government have very low levels of power, of local control, of ability to raise revenues for anything, frankly, including issues related to climate change. So, for example, during the pandemic, you saw a lot of pedestrianisation taking place, which is fantastic. Some of which, we hope we'll never go back to car routes. But where you wanted to pedestrianise a street that had a bus route on it, you can't do that. You've got to go to national government to get permission, and that can take 18 months to go through that process. You're not certain whether you're going to. That absolutely should be in local control. There are many small things like that. Then some big things like congestion charging, and we've seen in the past when Greater Manchester attempted this, actually they were forced to a referendum on it. It wasn't in the local gift to do that. And we also need within that piece around decentralisation, I think there does have to be a mature conversation about the revenue streams available at the local level to tackle climate change and deliver net zero. And those revenue streams, apart from very small amounts of charging, are largely around council tax and business rates, and that is a system which is not working very well now. There is a real crisis there. So we need to look at the broader fiscal base as a route to changing behaviours and financing net zero. And just again, as an international comparison, cities in the UK keep about 7% of the total tax base raised in them. In North America, it's 50%. Across the OECD, on average, it's about 25%, something like that. So, and if we could get that up to somewhere around 12 to 15%, I mean, that would be an extraordinary journey to go on, but that would give access to a huge amount of innovation and enable all sorts of innovative financing mechanisms around this. And then the third final challenge I want to mention is that the funding that is available nationally, in my view and the view of many of the cities that I work with, is not being used strategically enough. So we have relatively small amounts of money available, which generally speaking, we are being made to compete for. And that just drives out innovation. The idea is that competition drives innovation. In this market, it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. It's collaboration that drives competition. We've all got to get this right. What's the point in making, one place net zero and not others? So that needs to be more strategic and aligned to a national local strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's why we talk a lot at LGIU about connected localism. You've got to get that sort of improvement through collaboration, innovation through collaboration. So that's really helpful, Chris, but it's not very encouraging in a sense, in that if you look at those three challenges, we're told, one of the clear messages coming out of COP is that we have a decade. The next decade is crucial. We have to get this right over the next decade. If we had been sitting here a decade ago, many of us were sitting here a decade ago, would we have been saying we need to solve the social care crisis, we're too centralized, we need to reform local government finance? Yes, we would, because we were saying all of those things a decade ago. And yes, we've had devolution, a degree of devolution in our major city regions, which is positive, but our progress across all of those challenges has been relatively limited. And actually on some of them, particularly the competition bidding around pots of money, we seem to be, it's even worse than it was 10 years ago. So how do we unlock, we haven't unlocked progress on those challenges for much over the last 10 years. How can we ensure that we do over the next 10 years? I'm going to put that to Mark first and then come back to you, Chris, and you. Because Mark, I'm guessing that you would agree with almost everything Chris said. Though.
Yeah, that should be my first line. I think Chris has it bob on. I think we do have a degree of devolution in Greater Manchester, but it's nowhere near as much as we need. And
it's not devolution. I remember at the time of the Greater Manchester deal saying, this is great, but we get excited about it. Tell it to someone in Paris or Berlin or New York, and they'll look at you like you're mad. Who did this stuff before? Someone 200 miles away. It's crazy.
It's not the same level of autonomy that you see in other, particularly European countries. So let me try and reframe the question, because I think if we worry too much about what hasn't happened in the last 10 years, we will get ourselves in a rut, because actually I don't see what those three things changing in the next 10 years. Do you? Not significantly anyway. So we need to figure out a way to move around the obstacle if we can't get over it. And I do think there is something here about local places working directly with the investment market to be able to establish portfolios of programs which have the opportunity to create return in the first instance, and then through some form of joint venture or partnership, utilize some of that return to stimulate the next investment cycle. One of the big issues that we have is, and it's well known, and government know this, is not that we lack projects, but we lack the de-risking finance to enable a project to come from a good idea to an investment grade proposition. And I think we're starting to get to the place now where we have a portfolio of projects that will create a return. And we are starting to look for partners who will work with us in the longer term to be able to reinvest some of that return in the next pipeline of projects, which gets away from national finance completely. And as Chris said in his first remarks, that's a lot easier to do in certain projects than it is in others. So energy generation projects, typically you can do that. Transport, sometimes you can do that. But when it comes to domestic energy efficiency, then it becomes an awful lot more difficult. It's a negative NPV. So what do we need to do? Well, some of the work we've done suggests that there is a reasonable percentage of the population who are in that able to pay area, and they will invest themselves in their home because they're used to doing that, but they're put off by the complexity of what they need to do. So I think what a role for local authorities is helping to demystify and almost de-risk in some ways activity that will encourage private investment by both individuals and by companies. So I think we can take away some of that fear factor about, what am I getting ripped off here? Is this the right thing for me? And that's certainly some of the things that we're going to be doing in the next 12 months or so. It's partly around helping to create informed clients so that they know what to do and they can invest themselves. I think I agree totally with Chris around competition. We are seeing more and more centralized funding being offered out as competition, which basically creates winners and losers. And actually, I don't think that's helpful, because what it means is the limited resources that local authorities have are put into bids that may or may not succeed. And if they don't succeed, they've wasted a shed load of time for no outcome at all. And I'll be honest and say Greater Manchester has been relatively successful in that in the last couple of years, but there's no guarantee that will continue. So I think that this is where collaboration does come in. And I do think that scale is important, and we should be looking to our near neighbours in particular to try and get a quantum of scale that allows us to put an offer to government which is more efficient in terms of its on costs, and that make it more attractive in that way. And I think that's a second thing that I think is something that the Northwest region in particular could do as a unit. And then finally, I think there is something around creating the right narrative for people and making sure that our politicians are creating the right narrative. And because that doesn't require money, what it requires is trust. And I know it's wavered over the last few years across government, whether it's local or national, but I still do think that local authorities hold the trust of a percentage of their population. Certainly, if my local authority writes to me and it's got something with a local authority stamp on it, I'll take more notice of it than if it's just a private company putting a letter through my door. So I think there's something about utilizing that trust to be able to convince people that there is a different way to live their life. I think politicians are starting now to get to the crux of the matter, which is you can't sell a hair shirt. You can't tell people that they can't fly and that they need to stop eating meat, and they need to do, without selling it in a way that helps them to understand how they can do that and have a better life as a result, or do things differently. And I think that's where the narrative needs to go. We need to be, that there are two risks here that I think we need to avoid. Some people will disagree with this, but you hear constantly people saying, if everybody just makes a small change, then everything will be fine. And I'm afraid that's a lie. It's just not true. We need everybody to make quite big changes. And we need to be able to sell those big changes in a way which makes people comfortable that they're not going to have a poorer quality of life as a result. And I think that needs to be a key narrative for our politicians.
That's a really important point. And again, that comes back to to framing things around place, doesn't it? I mean, one of the things we've seen done effectively local authorities saying, well, this is also about your kids, the air pollution outside your kids' school. No one thinks that's a good idea. It's about finding the positives and the sort of. Anyway, Anna Marie, you wanted to come in. So some of this may look different from an Irish perspective. So the challenges around social care, and we think you're a little less centralised in Ireland than we are here. But I think a lot of the challenges around finance will probably feel quite similar. And then I think interestingly at the end, the points Mark was making sort of chimed for me with some of the points you were making about how you bring communities with you on this journey. Really interesting your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, for that. And I think a lot of what Mark said there resonates here as well. I mean, there are many challenges facing local government in confronting climate change, and it's a very expansive learning curve to start with. I suppose, what do we do and where do we start? And I suppose across societies, there are levels of fear and uncertainty, and there's certainly considerable debate on the need for greater ambition, including the need for transformative measures to reduce emissions. And Mark is alluding to some of that ambition there, and the need that, like, each small change is not enough, it needs to be bigger. And I suppose we need to realise that ambition. We hear of the challenges, for example, of decarbonising key sectors like agriculture and transportation, tourism, and these can be portrayed really as negative impacts. So it's not difficult for people generally to make that jump to having those concerns or fears about the negative economic consequences, for example, income and job losses, the amount of investment that's needed, the fear of what change will bring. And it can have an overwhelming effect on people. And I think the greatest challenge for local government is also our greatest opportunity. And that's to help combat that fear and uncertainty, and to support a focus on climate action through the lens of opportunity. And I suppose this means that, again, that local government will need to lead by example and to demonstrate what can be done. And it's that leadership role that's critical. I suppose this means that we have to communicate the core benefits of climate action responses. And we see, I suppose, here from an Irish perspective, we can see that the European Green Deal presents a very positive perspective on climate action, something now manifestly coming through at a national policy level. And I think that local government can take on a similar perspective to have a meaningful effect at local level. And in doing that, it's presenting, at least here in Ireland anyway, an opportunity for local government to take on a strengthened leadership role at local level. If I could give you an example of how we have started the journey as a local government system, we have explored the potential economic opportunities arising from climate action, and that's coming through our economic and enterprise remit. Local government in Ireland has established a multi-agency climate action economic opportunity steering group and a working group in 2020. I lead that project on behalf of the local authority chief executives, and we're supported by the climate action regional offices, which were established by the sector. The aim of the project really is to maximise the economic and enterprise remit of local government, to explore those opportunities that local authorities can help to realise in responding to climate change. And as a first step, we commissioned research with Maynooth University to identify the wide range of opportunities for the Irish economy and the areas in which local authorities can actively play a role in delivering. And those areas would include, amongst others, for example, the circular economy, renovation and retrofitting, reskilling and retraining, supporting existing and new enterprise on green innovations and green technology, provision of remote working facilities, placemaking, and that's just an example of some of the areas. We have taken the time to consciously communicate our findings and to disseminate that information throughout the network of local authorities in order to promote that shift in thinking and to develop the leadership role. Our overall approach, I suppose, really is to focus on projects and initiatives that will build on opportunity in the context of addressing climate change. We want local authorities to embrace and nurture that role because the benefits are clear and they outweigh a lot of the uncertainty. As the project progresses, I suppose we're very conscious that local government should stay ahead of the game by being local leaders in advancing the socio-economic opportunities from climate transition. And I suppose the European Green Deal and the European Investment Bank have clearly outlined how investments into the future will be made available to support that innovation and research by both the public and the private sectors. Tax incentives will also drive private sector involvement. These investments will help to drive the introduction of new sustainable products, services, new business models, increasing resource efficiency, as well as helping to make that transition piece work for us all. And I suppose we in local government fully intend to take advantage of these policy-led developments. Local government is pivotal, really, and I believe it's pivotal to successful local economic enterprise development. The need for new ways of living, working and travelling, they're well versed. The future where the climate is our centremost consideration doesn't have to be shrouded in fear. I think the prospects are positive. The challenge for local government is to help to realise those positives and to make it happen. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you. That's very inspiring. And again, that leadership role and that sort of connective role, and drawing down funding from European institutions, which is not so much an option for us. But look, I'm going to open it up in a few minutes, so to the audience. So please do put your questions to the panel in the chat. Before that, Chris, coming back to you, those three challenges you outlined, around social care, around centralisation, revenue streams of government finance, and around this sort of increasing sort of competitive bidding for pods. I guess Mark's response was, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but you've got to go round them because what's your take on how if those are the challenges that prevent us moving forward in this agenda, what do we do about that, given that they are profound challenges?
Yeah, Mark's completely right. They don't fully prevent us from addressing this agenda, but they're ones that we've got to bear in mind in terms of how we find and deliver solutions. I mean, the social care one, it is very difficult, and I just think we've got to keep that conversation alive. We've got to keep that conversation going, and that will just play out. It will play out one way or another. And if it plays out in the wrong way, it is clear it's going to affect capacity. It's as simple as that, really. But I think the way around, and really agree with Mark on this, is to get into the weeds of action. So within demonstrators, they can act as proxies, where you don't have to start by rewiring the national system. You can do this in a pragmatic way at the level of place, through place-based systems, and we've seen this happening already through things like co-commissioning, national and local agencies and funds co-commissioning into a framework at the local level. There's absolutely nothing stopping us from doing that now. I think we could put together, well, we are as core cities anyway, but put together from the sector a suite of relatively minor changes to powers that wouldn't require massive legislative shifts or anything, that would just help us move that conversation forward. I think the strategic use of national funds is a big issue, though, and that obviously that does take national government to make a shift there. But I think we've also then got to think about, well, what are the drivers here? What are the things that are going to drive change? And one of them for us as cities is bringing the private sector with us into the conversation and bringing their checkbook, frankly, into the conversation. Because if they're saying, yeah, we're ready to invest, we've got X billion floating and we're going to land that, but we want to see these changes, then you've got a different kind of conversation. You've got a different kind of dynamic to the local national conversation. But we are in that space now. I think that the local national dynamic within this conversation needs to evolve, and it needs to evolve quite quickly. I hope and I'm optimistic that it will. There are areas which are easier than others, but it's about a kind of joined up collaborative voice between public and private sector saying these are the things that we need to happen and that will enable investment, which will enable the change we need.
Okay, so between you've emphasised sort of working together. The things we can do now, like co-commissioning. You've emphasised the importance of sort of putting financial models in place, the importance of leadership and narrative around this. Mark made the point, and Chris and Anna-Marie both touched on it. I think that public trust is crucial to that. Particularly, I think, just picking up on your last point, Chris, particularly as if we need partnership with the private sector, if we need, we need those sort of complex, big partnerships to move forward. And Mark, you said, look, local government is still more trusted than other parts of the public and private sector, and that's true. But we also see some level of decline in that trust. Do we have a sort of trust deficit? We've written about this a lot. At exactly the time when all the sort of reforms we need, across public service reform, but particularly in this area, require greater collaboration, require greater trust between partners and between institutions and communities. But actually, we see a bit of a crisis of trust in institutions. How serious a problem is that? I didn't address that question to anyone in particular, but I'm interested to say. So we'll start with Mark, and then maybe bring in Marie. Chris.
I mean, the honest answer for me is I don't know, because I wouldn't like to say how far trust in local authorities, local government has eroded. I accept that it has to a degree, but I'm not convinced that at the end of the day, residents won't look to their local authority and their local politicians, because at the end of the day, they feel like they've got greater accountability. That democracy at the local level, arguably, in my view at least, is perhaps more prevalent than it is at the national level. You feel like you're voting for a person rather than a party sometimes at the local level. So I think that gives people a little bit more trust. I think that the second part to my answer would be, I don't think it has to be local authorities working alone. And therefore, if you can build a coalition, particularly with community groups and NGOs, and so it's not just the local authority speaking alone, it is a collective, then you stand a better chance of getting to those people who wouldn't want to listen to local authorities in isolation. And I think that has to be a key part of the mantra as well. So on the trust bit, I think that it's not just about trust, actually. It's also about vectors of communication. And I think increasingly, no matter whether local authorities, people trust local authorities or not, local authorities find it ever more difficult to engage with their populations. And the direct mail drops, obviously, and things that go in with bills, they sort of work. We know they work, but people are so reliant now on social media and indeed mainstream media that communications link between local authorities and their residents, I don't think is as strong as it once was. Yeah. And so actually we need to find a way to re-engage and link with our communities in a way which allows people to hear messages, whether they decide to accept them or not, and whether they decide to trust them or not. Because otherwise what we've got is a communications deficit. Yeah.
And again, a decade ago, we were all very hopeful about sort of social media as a way of doing that. But increasingly, the development has been in reality that increasingly social media is a set of sort of closed rooms that doesn't work for that sort of thing. So there is a real challenge there. And Anna Marie, all the stuff you were talking about requires that sort of element of trust between communities and local government. Is that an issue you're wrestling with in Ireland, or do you feel confident about that?
Sorry, the mute wasn't working there for a second, Jonathan. Thanks for that. Yeah, look, we do quite a bit of community engagement and collaboration, and it's really the way we work, I suppose, through a lot of the programs that we have. And from time to time, trust gets eroded, and you have to build it back up again. And it's a matter of keeping those relationships going. And I suppose maybe I might expand on the previous point that I had in relation to the economic opportunities and how we link in with people, I suppose. And I mean, Mark alluded there to the wider sectoral engagement and engaging with stakeholders and the collaborative piece. And that's critical. That's critical for us. I suppose our regional just transition team has been an example of how that collaboration works. And I think local authorities are best placed to pull together all of those agencies and communities at a local level. But I suppose as part of the economic opportunities project that I mentioned, we were fortunate as well that yourselves came on board, Jonathan, the local government information working unit to undertake research to look at examples of how local government across 9 jurisdictions across the world are capitalising on opportunities. And I think that included Australia, Ireland, the Nordic countries, the UK and the US. And that research explored examples of under 14 themes across those jurisdictions. And the research demonstrated a wealth of diverse and very impressive projects that local authorities are pivotal in leading. And there's learning to be gained from those projects and cross-transfer of that information to all local authorities. Those projects range from energy and power generation to transport, from afforestation and protection of the natural environment, promotion of things like the circular economy, from innovation in the public realm to smart cities, and tourism projects. And that was just a few of the examples that came out of that research. I suppose the goal of most projects has been to respond to the challenge of climate change by reducing emissions and to build resilience. And all of the projects could easily demonstrate wider economic and social co-benefits at a local level, including increased job creation, new employment opportunities, additional amenity value, less pollution and waste, better places, reduced energy costs and more efficiencies, and increased social justice. So really, I suppose, the projects show the broad influence that local government brings to bear on delivering effective climate action at regional and local levels. But it's great to see and learn what local governments can and are doing. So when, I suppose, what we should be doing more of the same, I suppose, really, in terms of what we're doing, and learning from those exemplars of best practice. It's been alluded there to by Chris and Mark as well, that I suppose the track record of local government or subnational government delivering climate action initiatives and projects is significant, and there's a great acknowledgement that they do demonstrate far greater ambition and success than national local government. And we see this through things like the Global Climate Coalitions, like the Covenant of Mayors or ICLE, the Climate Alliances. And I suppose the project case studies explored by the LGIU clearly demonstrate the high levels of ambition that are underpinned by a confidence and a competence to deliver effective climate action at local level. The key, I suppose, that success is the support of, I suppose, we have support of administrative structures, those structures and the processes within local government, the building of those collaborative projects and our partnerships. And as I said, those collaborative partnerships, local authorities are best placed to work with those agencies within their areas and to pull in the agencies that they need and the communities. I suppose really another key to that is their well-grounded relationships with their citizens, the engaging with communities part, which is critical to the work that we do here and has been very critical through the whole just transition process here in Offaly and that wider Midlands region. Delivering the strategic local level plans and sharing and supporting each other in those climate experiences and learning from the climate experiences of others. And I suppose another key factor, and this is how local governments are championing a leadership role on climate action. And back to that leadership piece again, our relationship with the citizen is critical to success on climate action. And I suppose we listen to them across a range of fronts, across all age levels, across all strata of society. We protect communities, we bring communities along the journey, we create outcomes that are desirable for and by the public. So when I say really that we should do more of the same, I think we should be doing what we're good at. We plan for and deliver projects, we build successful partnerships, and we maximise the benefits of the local economies to help them to thrive. And I think the collaborative piece is critical. I think we're very well placed from a collaborative engagement piece. We have structures here at local level that allow us to engage properly with communities and with stakeholders to try and deliver that element of change. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you. I was modestly refraining from mentioning the excellent research we did on this, but I'm glad you did, and I'll talk at the end about how people can see that. Look, you and Mark both talked about that sort of engagement with communities, engagement with NGOs. We've talked about engagement with the private sector. Yeah, as we're doing this event with the Heseltine Institute, it also feels remiss to mention the potential for engagement with universities. We've got Sue Jarvis from the Heseltine Institute here. Sue, I don't know if you'd like to say a little bit about that potential, and then I'll come back to Chris for some thoughts, and then we'll go to the audience question. I'll unmute you.
Thanks.
There you go.
Thanks, Chris. Jonathan, for that. I needed to be unmuted. Yes, I just want to really add, first of all, to endorse the place leadership role of local government in this agenda, because I think it's really, really important. But often, sometimes the role of other anchor institutions across the place doesn't always get reflected in the same way. So it's more a plea to really reach out to your local universities and anchor institutions to try and understand what they're also doing to move towards net zero. And just an example from the University of Liverpool, we have a formal commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we embed that through our strategy. And within that, we have a whole range of cross-institutional groups that look at things around the university estate. So similar to local authorities, get your own house in order and demonstrate how you can reach these targets. But what I really wanted to mention was the role of research and innovation. So we have a Climate Futures research strand that is really trying to get the best out of our research excellence and how we can apply that to the climate agenda and how that can be utilised by local government and by the private sector to look at innovative solutions. So think about things like that. But then also at the smaller scale, we do quite a lot of work with local communities and helping to facilitate citizens panels, and there's a lot of interest in discussing climate change and that agenda. So it's really just think more broadly about what's also out there, because I think you'll find we're all talking with the same voice, and we can bring some additional resource to help move forward this agenda.
Yeah, that's a really, really useful point, Sue. Thank you. And of course, on citizens assemblies, I mean, I don't even have a number. I've lost count of the number of councils that have been running climate assemblies, but it's clearly been proven a really useful way to sort of bring this agenda to the front. Chris, just any quick thoughts on these issues around sort of engagement, collaboration, and trust before we go to the questions from the audience?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a sort of a very strong kind of element of psychology to all of this, actually, in changing mindset and changing behaviours. And if we look at, there isn't anything that's really comparable, but other sorts of issues, what is and is not socially acceptable can be a very, very powerful tool for change. It can be quite a lengthy process to change that, but it can change. And I think you can see that actually in things like the way that sponsorship is working. That companies that do not have good green credentials are not being accepted for that individual investments, ethical investments are growing, and so on and so on. And there's a lot of really interesting work from people like Behavioural Insights unit on this, in how you change behaviours around use of energy and so on. But also I think part of this is about articulating the co-benefits of the net zero pathway. So for example, if you look at housing retrofit, that's a massive skills and employment dividend potentially. Housing retrofit employs typically twice as many people as new build. So if you start talking to people about jobs, jobs for you, your children, in the future economy with shifts that are going to happen anyway, that's a different conversation to, it's going to be a bit annoying for some people to come around and drill holes in your walls, and fill them or whatever. There's a couple of points people mentioned in the chat. There's one on adaptation, and I do think that actually this is a really important point, and it can get missed in net zero, and there are financial models that can help with that. So for example, if you put in flooding defences, and so land values can be maintained, there is a financial return there, but our system at the moment doesn't loop that back in to the expenditure. There are models that can do that, if we had a bit more freedom to do them. And just final point, someone from Australia in the chat as well, I noticed, which is great to see people from other countries joining. And we had a dialogue with some Australian cities recently. The G7 happened, and when we noticed that there was no single element of the G7 that was about place, that was about cities or local government. So we set up a parallel dialogue and called it the Urban 7, and invited city networks from all of the G7 nations and the associates and a group of Australian cities came along to that. And what was really striking about that was that even where we look at, America as part of that, Japan, Korea and so on, where we think of actually places are quite devolved, the two issues that came up from every single in-country city network was A, that the dialogue with national government isn't great, that actually they don't feel heard in the right way, and B, that their biggest priority was this agenda, and they want to work together on this agenda. So I think we are seeing that. We are seeing this kind of global local collaboration, but we need the local national collaboration to kind of get alongside that, really.
To balance, yeah, we need a balance of those things. Don't we? Look, I'm going to pick up a couple of other points from the chat, and thank you, Chris, for highlighting our friends from Australia joining us. I was going to flag that, so we're very grateful to them for staying up so late to join this event. I'm going to try and group the question, the sort of points from the chat a little bit. We've got a bunch of questions from Councillor Mott, from Lucy, Lucy Booth, and from Jonathan, a different Jonathan, around the sort of how do you create change. So yeah, someone's saying, look, where I am, we're actually getting, even we're talking about, it's not just small changes, we need big changes, but we're getting a lot of pushback even on small changes. It's not easy. Lucy asking, how do we, and I guess this is sort of elaborating on some of the points earlier, how do we sell that reduction in sort of consumerism to residents, to businesses, to investors, and how do we, and is there a role for local government in engaging large corporations in this? So if it's not just the point Mark was making, it's not small changes from individuals, it's big changes from all of us. How do we engage kind of bigger organizations or bigger multinational organizations in that? And then I guess from my colleague Kim asking a similar question about how do we move with other public service institutions? How do we engage with the NHS, for example, which is a huge employer, a huge energy user, a huge partner? So I don't know who wants to come in on this, but this question, so two things, I guess. How do we sell to individuals? We've talked about that a little bit. Secondly, how do we engage? So we probably don't need to cover that so much, but how do we engage those big players, whether they're big institutional players, whether they're other public sector organizations or large private sector organizations? Mark, any thoughts on that from the Greater Manchester perspective?
I think there's two distinct questions, and I'll try and answer the last one first. Some of the largest corporates, the global corporates, the brands that we all know and love, are already on this journey. And I think it's about hooking up with them and trying to hold them to account in some ways, because whilst I won't mention names, I think some of the claims that are being made about we're carbon neutral already need some scrutiny. So I think partly it's about working with the grain of those companies that are already on this path and helping them through their supply chains to engage the next tier down. We're starting to do this. We've only really just kicked it off, but we've created something called B Net Zero, BEE Net Zero, which is really trying to make a framework for businesses in our city region that will enable them to set out a zero carbon plan, or net zero carbon plan, and stick to it in the easiest possible way. And I think there's a role there for not just local authorities, but for the wider political, the wider public authorities, if you like, wider than local authorities. Public sector is the word I was looking for, sorry. Wider public sector to try and lead by example and not try and preach to business, because they won't listen, but creating a network and facilitating the ability for businesses to speak to businesses. And so it becomes a business to business interaction is something that I think we can do. So rather than create a public sector funded business support mechanism, create a frame which allows larger businesses to engage with smaller businesses, not just in their supply chain, but to enable that transition to happen. That would be my first answer. My second, around how do you create change? I think I have a mantra which I think holds pretty true, which is if you want somebody to change what they're currently doing, you need to make it either cheaper or easier or sexier, and preferably more than one of those things. And I think that Chris mentioned something else, which was around public acceptability, and I think I would put that into the sexy box, if you like. I think there is something about trying to get people to value those things which are less carbon intensive. Education is a really good example. Some arts, a pretty good example of that. I worry a little about the idea that we're going to turn capitalism on its head in the next 6 years. And capitalism is basically based on consumerism. I just don't think that will happen. So I think what we need to try and do is create alternatives to the things that people want that are intrinsically lower carbon and lower resource implications for our planet, and then find a way to make them cheaper, sexier, or easier, and that shift will happen automatically. I think that's actually the challenge, and that's why when my first answer was around innovation, if you recall, that's why I think innovation is hugely important, because I don't think we can defeat consumerism. I'm not even sure I want to, actually. I enjoy buying things just as much as anybody else. But we do need to make it lower carbon, and therefore we need to find ways to make people or help people to buy and value those things which are least detrimental to our planet.
Okay, Anna-Marie, how cheaper, easier, sexier? Is that the way to engage? Is that what you're trying to do in a government in Ireland around that community engagement?
Creating change, I suppose, is never easy, and indeed any change generally is difficult. And I suppose we've found that throughout the just transition process, really here. And I suppose Mark has alluded there. He's mentioned things like how you engage with the community, and it might be in relation to the arts piece. First of all, I think you need to develop a bit of resilience in communities as well in terms of what they're doing and the experiences that they're having. The affordability piece is a big piece, I have to say, for communities as well. How they adapt and how they afford that adaptation, and I think there are certainly mechanisms there to do that. But I suppose if you look at some of the just transition projects, and Mark mentioned arts, but there are also heritage projects and environmental projects that also assist with bringing people along that path to change. And in terms of engaging with the bigger business and other agencies, I suppose persistence in trying to engage with them and keep them at the table, and also a bit of resilience to keep the whole program going. Very necessary traits, I have to say. At local level, I suppose, from our own local authority point of view, we would host local enterprise offices within the local authority system, and they would run things like Green for Micro programs, 2-day programs for business to help them adapt, and it's part of that engagement with business again. But when we're looking at kind of larger, maybe local authority led projects, and we're trying to engage with bigger business or bigger companies, we do need that financial leverage piece, and I suppose it comes back to that piece again, and we do need that. But if you look at kind of what's happening across the sector, there's a very good and effective effort at local government level across the economic and the social sectors. But that needs to be supported at regional and national level, especially in ensuring the policy integration piece between government departments and ministries in order to maximise support for local government in translating those climate policy requirements at local level. If government departments are on different pages, it's going to frustrate work in the delivery of critical infrastructure by local government. Then at the international level, I suppose policymaker needs to be cognizant of the capacity of local democracy to lead transition towards that carbon neutrality. And I suppose really the voice of local government, and through it the voice of local communities, then has to be central to advancing that climate neutrality as a positive feature to socioeconomic vitality, really, rather than a negative challenge for stressed communities.
Absolutely. Okay, I've got 3 areas that I want to, we're sort of got about 15 minutes left. Well, we have a time, 14 minutes left, in fact. I've got 3 areas I want to address and to give each of the speakers time for a sort of final reflection. So points that have come through on the chat. So there's a point about effectively about planning and building and how we use, how we put conditionality on new developments to sort of ensure low energy usage. There's a really interesting point about the potential for sort of data and digital and how we can sort of use that more effectively. And there's a point asking specifically about, well, actually, how does this look sort of different here? Some of our focus has been on sort of cities, but this feels very different in rural communities where there's less public transport, less electric vehicle charging points. Houses are sometimes more listed buildings, harder to sort of to retrofit. So I think, and feel free to kind of answer a different question if you don't like the one I give you, but I was going to ask Chris about data, Mark about planning, and Anna Marie about sort of rural, how we sort of develop this in a specifically rural question. So Chris, is our use of data sufficiently strong in this area?
Well, simple answer is no, and there's a lot more that we could be doing on this and joining the dots. And just an example of that is that I've been doing some work recently on the kind of the biological impacts of climate with a neuroscience lab based in London called Centric Lab, and their data is absolutely stunning on the impacts of, for example, air quality, poor housing and so on deprived communities, what that means in terms of physical and mental health outcomes. They've demonstrated, things like kind of low-level post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, by looking at brain chemistry, how it works, and so on. So you get a massive read across to health from that data, and what that tells you is you've got to do something, otherwise that's going to impact massively on NHS and so on. And just one example. But I think the health is quite the way that health and public health organises itself is around crises is quite an interesting model. And if we look at, so we're talking about changing behaviours, if we look at the way that we responded, this kind of the best of the public health responses to the pandemic, I think that does offer up a kind of model for the way in which we should be responding to climate change and net zero. If we treated it a bit like we treated the pandemic in the best of the responses, that could move us forward, where there was very clear messaging, there was very strong local engagement, there was a lot of stick and carrot. And of course, that did not happen all the time, but we can all, I'm sure from local government, think of examples where that did happen. So that, I think, does offer a way forward. And on rural, I think cities obviously is what my job is about, but they're all linked. The point is absolutely right. They're all linked. They're linked economically, they're linked in terms of labour flows, and they're certainly linked in terms of the climate change agenda. So we've got to get it right everywhere, and we can all learn from and work with each other in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really important that point about the pandemic, if we are to take a silver lining from the pandemic, or to take an opportunity, it has been, we've really seen what has worked well and what has not worked well in terms of engaging the public as a whole, and in terms of bringing communities with us. And we've had very clear examples of each of those that we can learn from. Mark, do you have any thoughts on how we use sort of planning more effectively as building and sort of getting at more energy, using the levers that local authorities still have around planning as planning authorities to get lower energy homes in place?
Yeah,
and not just homes, buildings generally.
So I'll talk a little bit more broadly about planning to begin with, and then I'll focus down on the regulatory role. I do think that development of local area energy plans is going to be crucial. I think as our energy system decarbonises and decentralises, the interrelationship between built infrastructure, energy infrastructure and transport infrastructure becomes ever more interrelated and ever more complex. And the only way really to chart out a path towards, in our case, carbon neutral by 2038, but add in your own date wherever, is to fully understand what that transition looks like. So we've started a programme of local energy plans across all 10 districts of Greater Manchester. There are other places that are doing it. I think we're probably the more advanced. And I do hold up a lot of hope for that, because I think what it does is take the best available data based on some primary research we've done, but also just taking the best of the ONS data. And we now understand the energy efficiency of our domestic stock across the whole conurbation, 1.2 million homes. We understand the energy efficiency of our public sector stock, and we've got a programme of activity to try and reduce that over a period of years. We know less about the commercial stock because all we've got is fairly limited data. But then we know what the energy system is capable of doing. We work closely with the DNO, both gas and electricity DNOs. We know what the transport system is capable of. And if we make the assumption that people are going to move to electric vehicles, we know what the charging infrastructure is going to look like, or potentially look like, based on people who have drives will charge at home, but elsewhere we'll need to create hubs. And then finally, we know where there are patches of land where which we could use for local energy generation. And I think bringing all that together into local energy plan, so that you've got almost a street by street understanding of what the current energy system is and what the future energy system needs to be to get to your target, whatever that target might be, will then really start to influence local plans and local planning. So that's my first part of the answer. The second part, coming on to the planning system per se, is I'm going to give you some mixed messages here. So we have put in our spatial framework for Greater Manchester an accelerated target which goes beyond Part L and beyond the Future Homes Standard when that comes in. And it's for net zero buildings by 2028, in effect. And we did that because the national framework was not sufficient to get us to where we needed to be. However, I've got to say that in an ideal world, I don't think local areas should be setting their own planning standards. I think what that creates is an unlevel playing field, and it just makes it more difficult for developers to keep their costs down when they are planning developments in different parts of the country. So whilst we've done it, and I think it was probably the right thing to do, it would have been far better if we'd had national standards which were much more ambitious than they currently are. I think the planning system is a really valuable tool, but as somebody said in the chat, you have to be careful about viability. And there are certainly instances where a potential development in London or the southeast would remain viable given certain circumstances that would become inviable in the north of the UK. And I think that's a real challenge that we need to try and get around, again, by looking at two things. One, how can we support those developers to construct in a way which is not just zero carbon, but is also mindful that whilst they need to make a profit, there are better ways and easier ways to create some of these properties at a marginally increased cost. And the second is to recognise that if we do it in the right way, both potentially land values and property values can increase. And therefore, really what we're doing is trying to create systems that will have an elevated value in the future. And we're capitalising on that elevated value now. And it's getting that message across to developers and landholders that there's a different way to do this, which isn't the same as the financial mechanisms that have used previously, but potentially is equally lucrative. Well, they are able to make profit out of it. So I think there is something here about using the planning system in a way which is convinces developers that they have a long-term asset that they could that they can retrieve profit from. Final point on this is we have tried, not at the Greater Manchester scale, but in one of our boroughs, to add in conditions on existing properties. So if somebody needs any form of planning permission for an existing property, that they would need to uplift their property by an EPC rating. And it sort of works to a degree, but the legality of it is, if somebody pushes back against it, we haven't got a strong footing there. So I think that is possible, but I think that requires national legislation to make it firm.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. So on the topic of legislation, a point coming in the chat that I didn't want to lose. Steffi is making the point that in Wales, they've brought in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is having quite a big impact in terms of how the national government behaves. So is that something that we ought to be considering in the UK and other countries? That's probably a bigger debate than we have time for in the 4 minutes that are left. But I did just want to flag it up because I think it's an interesting point. And Anna-Marie, just any sort of, I mean, Offaly obviously is a fairly rural area. Any sort of specific sort of rurality issues that you've come across that have made this either more challenging or created better opportunities in a rural setting?
I suppose, Jonathan, really, we're looking at the opportunities there because there are, I suppose the pandemic has realised a number of them as well, in that there's remote working opportunities, and there's a development now of remote working hubs and locations, an awful lot of commuting to Dublin from rural areas in Ireland, and that obviously has consequential emissions, and you'll see during the pandemic that those emissions reduced. So I suppose we're looking at the remote working hubs and hot desking, that type of, and general office space for to I suppose counteract that commuting population whenever that does come back, and we're encouraging companies to allow their employees to utilise those remote working hubs. I suppose that's one part of it. Interestingly, you mentioned the well-being piece, because I suppose placemaking and quality of life has come very much to the fore as well. For a rural county like Offaly, there are opportunities in that in terms of the staycationing tourism, developing our greenways and blueways, and utilising the Shannon and the mountains, etc., for different tourism projects. So there are opportunities there as well in terms of the health and well-being piece. And I suppose from a town centre first initiative, which is happening as well, we're looking at the cores of towns and villages, relates back as well to what Mark was saying, and we're looking at pilot decarbonising zones in those towns and villages. So I suppose in terms of the rural piece, there are opportunities there for us. It's not without its challenges, there's no doubt about that, and there are significant difficulties and delays on things. But I do think, as well as that, you mentioned the digital piece, and I think that's critical as well for rural areas, and looking at the future of work and future employment opportunities. And I suppose we link in with universities, and it just relates into what Sue mentioned earlier about the universities and utilising them. We do link into the universities in terms of things like VEX robotics programmes, and I suppose in terms of the retrofitting programme as well, we link in with Technological University here and our local education and training boards to provide upskilling for employees that maybe are losing jobs in certain areas, to upskill for those retrofitting jobs. So there's potential and certainly opportunities there at a rural level.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anna-Marie. So look, one of my very few skills in life is finishing events on time, and I fear I'm about to not even achieve that. But so I'm just going to ask for some 30 seconds from each of our panelists very quickly, just as a closing thought. What's the one thing you want to achieve over the next year? Chris, what's the most important thing to you?
I think it comes back to collaboration, collaboration across local government, between local and national, public and private. And, we are starting that. I think we've got a good story to tell, but further to go, and then joining that up at the level of place.
Okay, Mark, what about for you? The one thing that you'd like to see happen over the next year?
I think I'd probably agree with Chris, actually. That'll keep it short and sweet for you. I do think that collaboration is going to be key.
Brilliant. Anna-Marie?
Okay, sorry. Just well, as both of them have mentioned the collaboration piece, I'll go with action. I suppose we've spoken about this. We've had various conversations about it. We now have climate action plans. And I think now is the time for action. We just go ahead and implement those plans and go ahead and get with the programme.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Okay, we're hitting time. That was a really, really interesting conversation. I think loads of food for thought, but also you're in a conversation that can often feel a little bit sort of paralyzing and a little bit sort of, yeah, my gosh, it's also, yeah, lots of positive views on what we can do in the local authority sector to move forward. So thank you all for coming. A couple of quick plugs for me. We've been doing a lot of work at LGIU, a lot of briefings around what's coming out of COP, a lot of work on climate action more generally. If you are an LGIU member, you will have access to all of that, and we will follow up with an email afterwards pointing you towards those resources. If you are not an LGIU member, though you really should be, but if you are not, please don't despair, because we also have material that's open to everyone, particularly including our global, Chris used the phrase global local. We have a newsletter called Global Local, which is doing a lot of analysis of COP and what's come out of COP. And again, you will all get an email pointing you towards that material. We've got some training events coming up. We've got more briefings to come on all of these issues. So we will follow up with all of you, all participants, afterwards with an email that points you towards those resources. Go to our website, lgiu.org, and sign up for all of that. So all it remains for me to do, 2 minutes over time, so even my one skill in life has let me down today, but I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to give particular thanks to our panelists, to Mark Atherton, to Chris Murray, to Marie Delaney. Thanks to the LGIU team behind the scenes for making it all work. Thank you to the Heseltine Institute for partnering with us, and thank you most of all to all of you for spending time with us this morning. Thank you. Goodbye.